Fall was always my favorite time of year. The air turned crisp, the leaves transformed into fiery hues, and the world seemed to slow down, as if nature itself was taking a deep breath before winter's arrival. But last fall, something changed. The season that once brought me comfort now carries a sense of dread that I can't shake. It all started with the festival. Every year, our small town hosted a harvest moon festival to celebrate the season's bounty. The streets were lined with booths selling homemade pies, hand-knitted scarves, and all sorts of autumnal trinkets. Kids ran around with sticky fingers from candied apples, while adults gathered around the bonfire to share stories and catch up on town gossip. The festival was the highlight of the year, something everyone looked forward to. But last year it was different. The moon hung unusually low in the sky, its light casting an eerie glow over the town. It was the biggest and brightest I'd ever seen, almost unnaturally so. There was something off about it, but no one else seemed to notice. They were too busy enjoying the festivities. I arrived at the festival just after sunset. The streets were crowded, filled with the sounds of laughter and music. I made my way through the throngs of people, exchanging pleasantries with neighbors and old friends. But as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The cheerful atmosphere felt forced, almost strained. People smiled, but their eyes were hollow, as if they were going through the motions without any real joy. The bonfire was already lit when I arrived at the town square. It roared and crackled, the flames licking the night sky, but the warmth I usually felt from it was absent. Instead, a chill ran down my spine as I approached. I noticed that the townsfolk gathered around the fire were unusually quiet, their faces bathed in the flickering orange light. They were staring at something or someone in the center of the circle, but I couldn't see what it was through the crowd. Curiosity got the better of me, and I pushed my way through the throng of people. As I reached the front, I finally saw what everyone was staring at. It was an old man, someone I didn't recognize, which was strange in a town as small as ours. He was dressed in ragged clothes, his face weathered and lined with age. He stood there perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the ground. No one spoke. The only sound was the crackling of the fire and the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. The man didn't move, didn't acknowledge the crowd around him. It was as if he was waiting for something or someone. "Who is he?" I whispered to the woman next to me, but she didn't respond. She just kept staring, her eyes unblinking, her expression blank. I looked around, realizing that everyone else was doing the same. No one was talking, no one was moving. It was as if they were all in a trance. A sudden gust of wind blew through the square, sending a shiver through the crowd. The old man finally looked up, his eyes locking onto mine. They were a pale, milky white, as if he were blind, but I knew he could see me. There was something in his gaze, something dark and unsettling that made my stomach turn. Then, without warning, he spoke. His voice was low and gravelly, barely more than a whisper, but it carried through the square like a thunderclap. "The harvest is coming," he said, his eyes never leaving mine, "and the moon demands its due." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, and for the first time, I saw fear in their eyes. The old man turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows as if he'd never been there. The townsfolk began to stir, whispering to each other, their faces etched with confusion and fear. The festival, which had been so full of life moments ago, now felt cold and lifeless. I left the square in a daze, my mind racing with what I had just witnessed. The old man's words echoed in my head, but they didn't make any sense. The harvest is coming. The moon demands its due. What did that even mean? The next few days were a blur. The festival ended, but the sense of unease lingered. People were on edge, their smiles tight, their conversations hushed. The weather took a strange turn as well. The crisp, clear days of early fall were replaced with thick, oppressive fog that clung to the town like a shroud. The sun barely broke through the clouds, and when it did, it cast a sickly yellow light over everything. I couldn't stop thinking about the old man and his cryptic words. I asked around, trying to find out who he was, but no one seemed to know. It was as if he'd appeared out of nowhere and vanished just as quickly. Some people claimed they hadn't seen him at all, insisting that I must have imagined it. But I knew what I saw, and the fear in the crowd was all too real. Then, one night, the dreams started. At first, they were just flashes of images. Dark woods, the harvest moon hanging low in the sky, the old man's face twisted in a grimace. But as the nights passed, the dreams grew more vivid, more disturbing. I dreamed of the town, but it was different, darker, decaying. The streets were empty, the houses abandoned. The bonfire in the square was extinguished, the wood charred and cold. In my dreams, I was always alone, wandering through the desolate town, searching for something I couldn't name. And every time, I ended up at the edge of the woods, staring into the darkness, knowing that something terrible was waiting for me just beyond the trees. But I could never see it, never find out what it was. I always woke up before I could take that final step into the woods. The dreams left me shaken, unable to focus on anything during the day. I became withdrawn, avoiding my friends and family, too afraid to talk about what was happening. I started sleeping less, terrified of what I might see if I closed my eyes. Then, one night, as the dreams continued to plague me, something happened that made my blood run cold. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard it, a soft shuffling sound outside my window. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest, straining to listen. The sound was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Someone or something was moving outside. I got up, moving as quietly as I could, and crept to the window. The fog was thick, obscuring everything beyond a few feet, but I could just make out a shadowy figure standing in the yard. My breath caught in my throat as I recognized the figure. It was the old man from the festival. He was standing perfectly still, just like he had in the square, his head bowed. But this time he wasn't alone. Behind him, barely visible in the fog, were more figures, dozens of them, all standing silently in the yard, their faces hidden in the shadows. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled back from the window, my heart racing. I didn't know what to do. My first instinct was to call the police, but something stopped me. What would I say? That a group of strangers was standing in my yard in the middle of the night? It sounded ridiculous, like the plot of a bad horror movie. But I knew it was real. I could feel it in my bones. I forced myself to look out the window again, but the figures were gone. The yard was empty, the fog swirling in the pale moonlight. I let out a shaky breath, trying to convince myself that I'd imagined the whole thing, that it was just a trick of the light and my sleep-deprived mind. But deep down, I knew better. The next morning, I found something that confirmed my worst fears. On my front porch, in the same spot where the old man had been standing, was a small pile of something. I hesitated before stepping outside, my heart pounding as I approached the spot. When I got closer, I saw what it was: grains of wheat, freshly harvested, scattered across the porch. I bent down, my hands trembling as I picked up a handful of the grains. They were still warm, as if they'd just been pulled from the earth. I let them slip through my fingers, my mind racing. What did it mean? Why were they left here? The old man's words echoed in my mind. The harvest is coming. The days that followed were a blur of fear and confusion. The dreams continued, growing more intense, more terrifying. The town seemed to grow darker by the day, the fog thicker, the sun weaker. People became more withdrawn, their faces pale and haunted. It was as if a shadow had fallen over the town, and no one could escape it. I started seeing the figures more often, always just at the edge of my vision. They never got too close, never approached me directly, but I could feel them watching. Their presence was a constant, oppressive weight, pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. I tried to avoid going out at night, but one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I found myself drawn to the town square. The bonfire was still burning, but the crowd was smaller now, the faces around it pale and gaunt. The festive atmosphere was gone, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. I stood at the edge of the square, watching the fire flicker and dance, casting long, twisted shadows on the ground. I could feel the eyes of the townsfolk on me, their gazes empty and lifeless. And then I saw him, the old man standing just beyond the firelight, his eyes fixed on me. He didn't say anything, didn't move. He just stood there watching, waiting. The fear that had been building inside me finally broke, and I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop until I reached the woods at the edge of town, my breath coming in ragged gasps. But the woods offered no solace. The trees loomed over me, their branches twisted and gnarled, blocking out the moonlight. The air was thick with the scent of earth and decay, and I could hear something moving in the darkness, just out of sight. I knew I should turn back, but I couldn't. Something was pulling me deeper into the woods, drawing me toward whatever was waiting in the shadows. My feet moved on their own, carrying me forward even as every instinct screamed at me to run the other way. The path through the woods was narrow and overgrown, the trees closing in around me like a living tunnel. I could hear the rustle of leaves, the snap of twigs underfoot, but there was no other sound. The world was silent, as if holding its breath. And then I saw it, a clearing up ahead, bathed in the pale light of the harvest moon. In the center of the clearing stood the old man, his back to me, his head bowed. Around him were the figures, dozens of them, all standing in a circle, their faces hidden in the shadows. I stopped at the edge of the clearing, my heart pounding in my chest. The old man raised his head, and for a moment, I thought he was going to turn around, to finally reveal his face to me. But instead, he raised his arms, and the figures began to move. They stepped forward in unison, their movements slow and deliberate, like marionettes on strings. As they moved, the old man began to speak, his voice low and guttural, the words incomprehensible. The figures reached the edge of the clearing and stopped, their heads turning to face me. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything to get away from them, but I was frozen in place, trapped by their gaze. The old man's voice grew louder, more insistent, and the figures took another step forward, their faces still hidden in the shadows. And then, finally, I saw it, the moon hanging low in the sky, casting its pale light over the clearing. But it wasn't the moon I remembered. It was different, larger, more menacing. It glowed with an unnatural light, casting long, twisted shadows that seemed to writhe and pulse like living things. The figures moved closer, their faces now visible in the moonlight. They were familiar, too familiar. They were the townsfolk, the same people I'd seen every day, but twisted and distorted, their features warped by some unseen force. Their eyes were empty, lifeless, their mouths twisted into grotesque smiles. The old man's voice reached a crescendo, and the figures began to close in, their arms outstretched, their fingers like claws. I could feel their breath on my skin, cold and fetid, as they reached for me. And then everything went dark. I woke up in my bed, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. For a moment, I thought it had all been a dream, a nightmare brought on by exhaustion and fear. But when I looked out the window, I saw the harvest moon hanging low in the sky, its light casting long, twisted shadows over the town. The next morning, the town was empty. The streets were deserted, the houses abandoned. The festival was over, the bonfire cold and dead. There was no sign of the old man, no sign of the figures. It was as if they had never existed, as if the town had simply vanished overnight. I don't know what happened to the others. I don't know if they're still out there somewhere, trapped in that twisted version of the town. All I know is that the harvest moon is coming again, and with it, the figures will return. The harvest is coming, and the moon demands its due. I had always been fascinated by abandoned places. There's something hauntingly beautiful about them. The way time stands still and the past lingers in the air like a ghost. So when I heard about the old amusement park on the outskirts of town, closed for years and rumored to be haunted, I knew I had to see it for myself. The idea of wandering through forgotten rides and derelict attractions was too intriguing to pass up. The day I decided to visit was crisp and clear. A perfect autumn day with a hint of chill in the air. I parked my car outside the park's rusted gates, which were barely hanging on their hinges. The overgrown grass and creeping vines had claimed much of the park's entrance, making it look more like a forgotten relic than an attraction. I squeezed through a gap in the fence and made my way inside, my camera slung around my neck and a flashlight tucked into my backpack. As soon as I entered, I was struck by the eerie silence. The only sounds were the crunch of dead leaves underfoot and the distant, mournful creak of an old ride swaying in the wind. The park was a sprawling labyrinth of broken attractions, rusting metal, and overgrown vegetation. The once bright colors of the rides were now faded and peeling, and the whole place had a sense of decay that was both fascinating and unsettling. The first area I explored was the old carousel. The once vibrant horses were now chipped and cracked, their painted eyes staring blankly into the distance. The carousel's canopy was tattered and hanging limply, and the music box that used to play cheerful tunes was now a silent, rusted relic. I snapped a few photos, marveling at the surreal scene before me. It felt like stepping into a forgotten dream. From there, I wandered toward the roller coaster. It was a towering skeletal structure of metal and wood, its tracks twisted and broken. The coaster cars were abandoned, their seats covered in a thick layer of dust. I climbed up to the platform, carefully making my way along the derelict walkway. The view from the top was both breathtaking and disconcerting. The park stretched out below me, a maze of faded attractions and forgotten memories. As I descended from the coaster, I noticed a sign for the park's old fun house. The building was partially hidden behind a thicket of trees and vines, and it looked even more decrepit than the other attractions. Intrigued, I pushed through the undergrowth and approached the entrance. The fun house's facade was a grotesque display of warped mirrors and peeling paint, and the entrance was flanked by two grotesque clown statues, their smiles frozen in a nightmarish grin. I hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. The interior was a maze of dimly lit rooms and hallways filled with the faint, musty odor of mildew and decay. The walls were lined with distorted mirrors that twisted reflections into bizarre shapes, adding to the disorienting atmosphere. I turned on my flashlight, casting a beam of light that flickered and danced across the walls as I made my way through the funhouse. I came across various attractions. Funhouse mirrors that made grotesque shapes of your reflection, a tilt-a-whirl with its seats rotting and falling apart, and a disused ticket booth covered in layers of grime. The deeper I ventured, the more unsettling the environment became. The silence was occasionally broken by strange noises, the distant sound of something clanging, the soft, eerie rustle of fabric, and the occasional thump that seemed to echo through the corridors. I was exploring a particularly dark hallway when I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. There, scribbled on the wall in what looked like red paint or dried blood, were crude, frantic messages. "They're watching. Don't stay too long. The mirrors are alive." I felt a shiver run down my spine, and my flashlight flickered as if in response to the eerie messages. Determined to find out more, I pressed on. I reached the central room of the funhouse, a large space filled with broken, dust-covered carnival games and dilapidated prizes. In the center of the room stood a large cracked mirror, its surface covered in a layer of grime. I approached it cautiously, my flashlight revealing a distorted reflection of the room behind me. As I studied the mirror, I noticed something unsettling in the reflection. In the dim light, I could see a shadowy figure standing behind me. I spun around, but the room was empty. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned back to the mirror. The shadow was still there, lingering in the reflection, its shape shifting and moving as if it were alive. I took a step back, my breathing quickening. The figure in the mirror seemed to be getting closer, its dark outline growing more distinct. I was about to turn and flee when I heard a noise behind me, a faint childlike giggle that echoed through the empty hallways. My flashlight flickered wildly, casting erratic shadows on the walls. Panic set in as I stumbled through the maze of hallways, the eerie giggles growing louder and more insistent. I felt a cold, clammy hand brush against my arm, and I spun around to find nothing but darkness. My flashlight finally died, plunging me into total blackness. The giggles continued, now joined by whispers and faint, indistinct voices. I raced through the funhouse, desperately trying to find my way back to the exit. The disorienting reflections and warped mirrors made it nearly impossible to see where I was going. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, as if they were urging me to leave. I felt a sense of impending dread, as if something malevolent was following me. Finally, I burst through the entrance of the fun house, stumbling out into the fading light of day. I looked back, but the entrance was now obscured by thick vines and overgrown foliage. The park seemed to have changed, the once familiar paths now twisted and unfamiliar. My sense of direction was completely lost as I navigated my way back to the main entrance, my heart still racing and my hands trembling. The park seemed to close in around me, the shadows lengthening as the sun set. I pushed through the gap in the fence and hurried to my car, my thoughts racing with what I had experienced. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me, that the park had somehow marked me. The laughter and whispers still echoed in my mind, and I could see the distorted reflection of the mirror in my mind's eye. The abandoned amusement park was no longer just a place of decay. It had become a haunting memory that I couldn't escape. The park remains abandoned, but I can't bring myself to return. The eerie giggles, the shadowy figure in the mirror, and the feeling of being watched are too unsettling to ignore. The park's secrets are still there, hidden in the twisted fun house and the broken rides, waiting for someone else to uncover them. I hope they never have to. My family owns a small farm that's been in the family for generations. It's a quaint place with a large farmhouse, a few barns, and fields that stretch out to the horizon. Every autumn, we host a harvest festival to celebrate the end of the growing season and to bring the community together. It's always a lively event with hay rides, games, and a massive potluck feast. This year was no different, or so I thought. The festival started off like any other. The air was crisp and filled with the smell of fall, freshly baked pies, roasted meats, and the earthy scent of fallen leaves. The barn was decked out in festive decorations, and the fields were lined with rows of pumpkins and corn stalks. We had a great turnout, with friends and neighbors arriving early to enjoy the festivities. As the sun began to set, the atmosphere grew even more festive. The string lights twinkled, casting a warm glow over the gathering. The kids were running around, playing games and getting their faces painted, while the adults mingled and sampled the homemade dishes. Everything seemed perfect. Around dusk, we gathered for the main event, the harvest feast. The long tables were filled with an impressive array of dishes, from roasted turkey to pumpkin soup. Everyone was eager to dig in, and the sounds of laughter and conversation filled the air. I was busy making sure everything was running smoothly when I noticed something unusual. A group of strangers standing by the edge of the field, just outside the perimeter of the festival. They were dressed in old-fashioned clothing, with worn hats and tattered coats. Their presence was in stark contrast to the modern festivities. Their appearance was jarring, but I assumed they were just latecomers or perhaps people who had wandered in from a nearby event. I decided to approach them to offer some food and see if they needed any help. As I got closer, I realized that their faces were obscured by shadows, and they seemed to be staring intently at the festival without acknowledging my presence. I called out to them, but they didn't respond. I felt a strange chill and decided to return to the festival, thinking it best to ignore the odd encounter. The night progressed, and the feast continued without incident. The conversation grew more animated, and the festival goers seemed to be enjoying themselves thoroughly. I tried to shake off the unease from earlier and focused on making sure everyone was having a good time. Later in the evening, I noticed that the group of strangers had moved closer to the festival, still lingering on the periphery but now much closer to the barn. They remained at a distance, almost as if they were observing us. The unsettling feeling grew stronger, and I couldn't help but keep glancing toward them. As the night wore on, we transitioned to the barn for the dance and socializing portion of the festival. The barn was packed with people, and the music was lively. I tried to enjoy the festivities, but my unease persisted. Every time I looked outside, I saw the strangers still there, watching from the edge of the field. At one point, I decided to take a break and step outside for some fresh air. As I walked toward the edge of the field, I saw the strangers more clearly. Their faces were still obscured, but their posture and the way they stood, almost as if they were rooted to the spot, gave me an eerie feeling. I approached them cautiously, calling out once more, but they remained silent and unmoving. Suddenly, one of them stepped forward, revealing a face that was gaunt and hollow-eyed, with an expression that was both vacant and disturbing. The others followed suit, their faces emerging from the shadows. It was then that I realized their eyes seemed oddly vacant, lacking any hint of warmth or life. The leader of the group spoke in a voice that was cold and distant. "We were invited," he said simply, though there was something unsettling about the way he spoke. His words sent a shiver down my spine. I tried to ask him more questions, but he offered no further explanation. The group remained silent, their presence becoming more ominous by the minute. I backed away slowly, my heart racing. I turned and quickly headed back to the barn, feeling a growing sense of dread. The strangers seemed to follow me with their eyes, their gazes fixed and unblinking. I re-entered the barn and tried to put on a brave face, but the unease was palpable. The festival continued, but the presence of the strangers cast a shadow over the evening. As the night drew to a close, I noticed that they had disappeared as mysteriously as they had arrived. The field was empty once again, and the air seemed to lighten. After the festival ended and the last guests had departed, I ventured outside to investigate the area where the strangers had been standing. The field was quiet and undisturbed, with no sign of their presence. I checked the periphery of the farm, but there were no traces of the mysterious visitors. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease from that night. I tried to brush it off as a figment of my imagination, but the memory of those vacant faces and the unsettling encounter lingered. The farm was as peaceful as ever, but the shadow of the stranger's visit remained in my mind. I never learned who they were or why they had appeared at our harvest festival. The incident became a part of our family lore, a mysterious and unsettling chapter in the history of our farm. Every autumn, as we prepare for the festival, I can't help but think back to that strange night and the eerie strangers who watched from the edge of the field. The farm continues to thrive, and the harvest festival remains a cherished tradition. But every year, as the festival approaches, I can't shake the lingering feeling that we might not be alone, and that the edge of the field might hold more than just the dark of night. The memory of that strange encounter serves as a chilling reminder of the unknown lurking just beyond the reach of the festive lights.